First news I saw when I got back to Canada a few days ago told me that Prime Minister Stephen Harper wants to make the plight of mothers and infants in the developing world Canada's signature initiative at the G8 summit. Well, gee, isn't that just great? Only, all that comes to mind for me and refuses to leave are the testimonies of communities I just met, like Lote 8, Lot 8, a pie in the hills in Guatemala near Lago Isabel, a community whose mothers and infants that Harper cares so much about have been completely blighted by hate and fate and rape and Canada. Lote 8, Lot 8, where the nickel in the ground has brought Canadian corporations Inco Sky, now Hadbay, all determined to do away with anyone there who's in their way, no matter how long they have been there, lived there, no matter whether they have anywhere else to go, to grow maíz, frijoles, plátano, to sow the seeds for the plants that feed their families. In a country where 18 families own over half the land, and where 80% of Guatemalan land that can grow food is not being used for food in the hands of the few who do go to Western supermarkets to buy their food. And I guess it's true that when the name you give a town is a number, Lote 8, Lot 8, and when you delineate the borders of a place with mineral exploration trenches, it becomes easier to designate people as property. Lote 8, Lot 8 is the people's property, and the people of Lote 8 have nowhere else to go. And so, after being evicted illegally by a Canadian company arriving unexpectedly with the police, private security, and what looked like half the Guatemalan army, over 700 men with guns who burned their homes, crops, lives to the ground, raining tear gas canisters, gunshots drowning out the sound of the sound, screaming, mourning, disbelieving what they were seeing, what was happening. But Lote 8 had nowhere else to go, and so after this eviction, this attack, they had to come back and start rebuilding. And 8 days later, the 700 men came back too. Only this time, the town men were off in the fields, and the police, army, security found only women and children in the town. And I feel like you know what I'm going to say, but the army, the police, the private security hired by our Canadian company did on that day, January 9, 2007. But I promised Elena Chokip that I would repeat how 8 men beat her and raped her and left her unable to move on the ground, and how she never gave birth to the child she was 8 months pregnant with at the time. And I wish I hadn't heard the same story from Irma Yolanda Chokak or lots of other women from that town. And I don't even think we can begin to comprehend how alone these women are, because if it's the Canadian company, the police, and the army that have raped you, well, who the hell do you have to turn to? And I wish these stories didn't exist, of mothers and infants on whom Canada has certainly left its signature mark. But they do, stark and clear, and so it makes me fucking sick to sit and ingest the hypocritic bullshit stories our leaders feel fit to share. And they say it all with straight faces. I can't face that the only thing I could stand up straight and say in Lot 8 was, Lo siento, I'm so sorry. Lamento mucho. And I said it so many times, Lo siento. I began to wonder, Lo siento, who I was apologizing for. And it killed me to know that all I could promise was that I would tell their stories when I got back home. I explained that I'm a nobody in Canada, that mining companies, the government wouldn't listen to me, that the G20, G8 are meetings of state where people sign signature initiatives for the plight of infants and their mothers without ever speaking to mothers, or listening to Canadians who have, or coming close to looking at the origins of this plight, or who should share in this fight of campesinos in Guatemala who know that if we would only go and leave them alone and bring our companies home, that would help much more than Harper's signature whatever. I want a G20, a G8, where Canadians are allowed to articulate that we want to say in what companies we all invest in through the Canadian pension plan, where we can take a stand and divest in Hud Bay, create laws that keep our companies at bay so Guatemalans can protest without facing arrest or being killed or abused by Canadian companies. I want a summit where we call it as it is, because if this isn't a new generation of colonization, then I don't know what the fuck it is. Or maybe these systems of raping and raising and segregating, creating euphemisms like community resettlement projects. Do you have a name, this community resettlement? Maybe we call it development. And I do believe this is development work if the worth you're developing is Canadian stocks. I want a G8 or 20 where we take stock of our country and the companies of our nation that run 60% of mines and mineral exploration around the world, Canadian companies, and where we ditch the reputation, the idealization of us as a peaceful nation, and instead work towards joining in solidarity with La Lucha, the fight of indigenous nations of Guatemala, which is our fight too. I want a G8 where millions of us cause a ruckus, put up one hell of a fuss, and finally admit that the plight of mothers and infants in the developing world is us.